Good evening and welcome to the Adam Smith Institute. My name is Matthew Kilcoyne. Welcome to our first webinar of 2021, and we are straight back where we started, locked down in the UK. But we start with a healthy dose of optimism this year, because whilst for a decade now, many economists and many technologists believed that we were undergoing what's known as the Great Stagnation, a period of poor productivity growth, an era of low technology innovation. It looks like, at least some of them suggest, that that may be coming to an end. Now, in order to understand that, we have to go through a bit of the reasons why. And we should understand that whilst the period of the Industrial Revolution saw technology growth go from absolutely near nothing for thousands of years previously to it, we saw an explosion of the physical world and what we were able to do, what we were able to create, the vast majority of us increasing our living standards to levels that were unimaginable centuries previously, to the point where now we live, many of us, in many comfortable lifestyles right across the world. But that productivity growth has stalled. In fact, between 1997 and 2007, across the UK productivity grew at about 2.1% each year. But between 2007 and 2017, that productivity growth was averaging at just 0.2%. And whilst the digital technological world saw a massive increase in what we were able to do, how we were able to do it, and how we were able to do it, the actual physical world hadn't changed very much at all. If we look around the offices and the houses in which we live, they look very similar to the ones that we were living in the 1970s and even the 1950s and prior to that. Now, last month, or actually in October of last year, Tyler Cowen, the economist who came up with the phrase, the Great Stagnation, speculated that we may be seeing signs that the Great Stagnation was coming to an end. We looked at how the vaccine for COVID-19 and mRNA vaccines more generally were allowing us to look at new diseases in quick, rapid time that we could destroy forever and make sure that humans were living happier, healthier lives for longer. But also things like lab-grown meat, driverless cars, things that had seemed like science fiction years before suddenly look like they're coming on board rapidly. To discuss this, I'm joined by three wonderful guests. We are joined by Daniel Caporo, the front bench editor at the Daily Telegraph, Alex Stapp, the Director of Technology Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., although he's joining us from Arizona, the wonderful free state in the desert state. And also we're joined by Sam Demetriou, who is a fellow of the Adam Smith Institute, but also is the research director at the Entrepreneurs Network. And he's been looking at fixing copyright, because as we all know, if we are looking at innovation, we have to also understand how that innovation ends up being rewarded in order for our market economy to then make best use of it. I'm going to go straight over to Alec, who's going to explain to us how technology is changing the world and how America was also leading some of that technological innovation once again, and how it can help lead the world and the Western world into another 21st century of great progress. Over to you, Alec.
All right, thanks, Matt. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to the Adam Smith Institute for hosting this conversation today. I'm excited to take part. And so for my short introductory remarks, I'm just going to expand a bit on what Matt said and give a little more background for the discussion we're having today and kind of give you a look inside my own conflicting opinions about what's been going on. And so I think this debate really comes down to reconciling two conflicting positions. And these are a lot of people in my own personal network and colleagues and mentors that I have who kind of sort themselves into two different camps. You have the Great Stagnation camp led by Tyler Cowen, as Matt pointed out, saying that we've actually had slowdowns in the rate of growth in recent decades compared to earlier in the 20th century. And so this is a big problem for human well-being and human flourishing. And just to add some more data from the US's perspective and to give a little more context, look at total factor productivity growth. So this is how much output do we get from all the inputs we use, both labor and capital. So if you get more output from the same amount of inputs, right, that's total factor productivity growth. That's kind of the magic sauce of economics, that you can get more from the same amount of inputs. That's what we really want. That's our main North Star in this debate. So from the end of World War II up until the early 70s, total factor productivity growth grew at around 2% per year in the United States. And then there was a big slowdown in the early 70s through the early 90s, about 0.5% per year. And then from the late 90s to early 2000s, it got up to near 2% again. Often we attribute this to the beginning of the IT revolution. but then the stagnation returned and growth tapered off again. And we've only had about 0.4% growth per year since 2005 in the United States. And so I think this data is kind of unimpeachable. It shows that we've had cycles, but mostly stagnation over the last 50 years, with a brief blip in the late 90s to early 2000s of growth due to start of computers, start of the internet, and the mass adoption of computers in the economy. And so I'm persuaded by that data. Part of me is like, yep, there's been a great stagnation, hard to deny it. But then there's another camp of people. I label this the rational optimist camp. This is the Steven Pinkers, all the great folks at Our World in Data, who always remind us that humans are biased towards being too pessimistic. They don't appreciate the gains we've actually had in recent years, and they often point out how certain data sets don't capture all the value and growth we've had in recent years. And so just some numbers on this. I think we all agree that the IT revolution has been kind of the biggest change in the last 50 years in the economy. And so what does that mean for our well-being? Well, most of these digital goods and services we consume are free to use, but we obviously as consumers value them more than $0 to use them. And so economists have studied this using massive online choice experiments to see how much people would need to be compensated to not have these kind of services for a year. And so rough numbers from MIT economists are that Americans would need to be paid $17,000 a year to go without search engines, $8,000 a year to go without email, $4,000 a year to go without digital maps, $1,000 a year to go without digital video, and another $1,000 a year to go without e-commerce. And when you think about, like, in the US, I think median household income is roughly like $65,000. So these are massive gains in well-being. And we're obviously not accounting for that in traditional measures of GDP. So a big part of me sides with these people and saying, like, let's not be too pessimistic. We've actually had major growth in the IT sector, and that impacts the rest of our lives. And so maybe we shouldn't be too worried about this. And so how do we reconcile these things? And so I'll just give some initial thoughts and we can have a great discussion later. But I think the way you can reconcile these things is that the average person has probably underrated the amount of growth we've had in the recent past due to the IT revolution. But we have been underachieving, and we can do much more in the economy. And I think you also need to distinguish between frontier growth, where we actually are seeing real stagnation in recent decades, and catch-up growth. The rest of the world, China and other developing economies, have made insane gains that have lowered global poverty, lowered infant mortality, really key measures to human flourishing and human well-being. And we shouldn't discount those things. But if we want to focus the debate on frontier growth, we've seen recent stagnation. And today I'm excited to talk about areas where might be future increases in the rate of growth. So like Matt mentioned, things in biotech, like mRNA vaccines. I think wearables are really exciting here with the Apple Watch and other devices that can monitor these things in real time. And then in energy, we have a lot of exciting growth in nuclear energy and geothermal systems. In transportation, huge advances in autonomous vehicles recently. Finally, long awaited, we're getting actual commercialization of autonomous vehicles. And then in space, we have the Starlink system. We're actually doing broadband via satellite systems, and that's going to actually solve the last mile problem of broadband in rural areas worldwide. And then lastly, just in IT, we're still seeing great advances in IT. And I think the biggest exciting thing here in the last year is Apple's advances with M1 chips and moving from multiple chips in a computer to systems on a chip to achieve great advances in efficiency. So they're seeing double the performance of previous models from Intel. And conversely, that means that you can get twice the battery life out of your mobile devices as well. So we're still seeing tons of gains in IT, and then I'm excited for the physical economy to start catching up as well in these other areas.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alec. I suppose one of the questions that I sort of have is like, how much is, like, a lot of technology is always overplayed in terms of its potential and then it arrives, and in many respects is sort of like, actually your life just it augments it in many respects, right? You low tech add it to your life. Are any of the technologies that you're seeing right now the real game changers that maybe the spinning jenny was that began the Industrial Revolution, or not?
Yeah, so I think in terms of one of the things that maybe isn't fully captured in the productivity statistics, and you often go directly to the healthcare industry, and you ask any person, like, okay, maybe you don't think that we're that much richer than we were 50 years ago, but would you like to go back and have the healthcare system 50 years ago? Would you like to lose all the medical innovations in terms of devices and therapies? And the first thing that comes to mind is I have one of my closest friends. His dad was diagnosed with cancer a year ago, and it was one of the cancers that would be terminal. There was multiple tumors throughout his body. It was gonna infect his lymph nodes, and they would have said 5 years before, they would have said, you now need to wrap up your things, and you have only X months or years to live. There's nothing we can do for you. But we've had amazing breakthrough in immunotherapy drugs that train your immune system to attack cancer like it were an external virus, and use your own immune system to actually fight cancer. And for my friend and for my friend's dad, that actually saved his life, and now he's cancer free and has a great prognosis for going forward. And so that's the kind of thing that I don't know if that's fully captured in productivity statistics, but advances like that in biotech, I think, could have transformational impacts for all of society. And so I know with mRNA vaccines, they already have an HIV vaccine candidate and vaccine candidates targeting cancer using that technology as well. And so how many of these technologies are general purpose versus only applicable in one situation? That's a big question, because general purpose technologies can actually raise the overall rate of growth in the economy and have big influences from that perspective.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very happy for your friend. Frankly, that is wonderful news. And that's kind of like optimistic take. I think that we're in dying need of in a period whilst we're locked down in the UK and people sort of held down by a virus that's out of control. Daniel, you look at the UK political scene on a regular basis, in fact, every single day via your newsletter Front Bench. Like, I'll do a quick little plug for that, let you do your own little plug for that as well. And a lot of sort of like what becomes fads very quickly becomes passé, but often it just ends up inviting a lot of people splashing lots of money on things that don't necessarily always come to fruit. Do you think that this time is different? Do you think there are exciting candidates for change? The UK is not as optimistic a country, let's be honest, as America maybe when it comes to technology, but can the UK make good use of tech to build out of this recession and build out the pandemic and build an optimistic future for the next decade or so?
Thanks. Yeah, so the newsletter, it's Front Bench. You can sign up for it. Just Google Telegraph Front Bench. It's sort of politics roundup in the morning, but not just for Westminster insiders. So you don't have to work in Westminster to read it. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, that's part of the big debate about productivity and how we shift it is how much of the balance should be government funding of R&D. Dominic Cummings, everyone knows one of his big projects was sort of a UK style ARPA or DARPA, depending which way you want to look at it. But at the same time, you have all these sort of classic examples of the government getting things completely wrong. The Graphene Institute I think it's in Manchester, isn't it? Hasn't kind of revolutionized the world. We all thought, 10 years ago, George Osborne was telling us that graphene was going to completely change the world and make Britain a new manufacturing superpower on the basis of this one substance, and it didn't work out. That being said, it depends which way you look at it, whether you're looking at the government trying to make these frontier breakthroughs, find the technology, set up labs that find and create the technology themselves, or putting the money into fairly new early on ideas to development. And in that case, it can make a big difference. One of the examples I was sort of looking at today is solar power, right? And there's two kind of key moments of intervention there. The one that everyone knows is Germany choosing to have the feed-in tariffs and eventually subsidizing solar power by the tune of something like 200 billion euros. And the big, obviously the other major factor there was Chinese manufacturers. It turned out it wasn't German manufacturers that benefited from that, it was Chinese manufacturers, but it was kind of the big kick, the big stimulus that helped bring the price of solar panels down. But the bit that's sometimes forgotten is that solar power was first kind of proven viable in the 1950s, and yes, it took 50 years to reach this kind of industrial scale. But what incubated it over that period, what kept it alive, what made it viable technology, apart from tiny ones on personal calculators, was the space race. Was massive government investment. They were willing to pay the outrageous amounts of money that you needed for very low power output to power their satellites in the space race, which is another point we can get onto later. But in terms of sort of breaking out of the Great Stagnation, this idea of needing a mission, of needing a purpose, and the idea that this rivalry with China might spur greater innovation in its own right. But in terms of the UK's ambitions, I mean, whatever we choose to do is going to be fairly small fry. So I think there was a figure I was looking at earlier today, which was that over the next 10 years, there'll be something unbelievable. Let me make sure that I've got this right, because it's a pretty wild figure. But over the next decade or so, we're expecting something like $10 trillion of private sector investment. That's according to Bain, between this year and 2030. So any kind of R&D investment that the UK government makes is going to be sort of, you know, tiny compared to that. So it needs to be targeted. But there is obviously a place for the government for government investment, particularly in these kind of early on niche technologies, and for providing uses for them to get them off the ground.
Dan, when you say, you know, when you want setting up a series of, so you was almost talking about a civilizational challenge there, whether it's China or the West, or whether it's UK on a national scale. Why not at the individual level? I think the UK, obviously, previously, you take the Industrial Revolution, you can either see it as a civilizational triumph of like the British state and its systems, or you can look at it as a series of individuals happening to improve their lives through technological progress, and it then benefiting everybody else. Which one do you reckon is more likely, A, to win out politically, and B, to be more realistic?
I think it's a combination of two, isn't it? I mean, you know, you look at the 1990s, and you know, the United States went through this period, Britain to an extent as well, of kind of self-doubt of what are we for, and this kind of idea of decadence. And it does help, even in the slightest sense, for a nation to have some idea of what everyone's pulling towards. But no, obviously you need to be harnessing the power of the market and harnessing the power of individual companies. You know, we're talking about DARPA, you know, one of the more, arguably the most impactful laboratory in the 20th century was Bell Labs, AT&T. But that was a kind of public-private partnership of sorts. It was Bell Labs that found solar power. They were the ones who discovered, I think this is correct, they discovered the PN gateways in silicon, which made the transistor possible. But a lot of these technologies obviously really took off because of the Cold War. I think if you look at the iPhone, you can see that if you break down each individual piece of technology within the iPhone, most of them originally had some kind of military use. Even Siri, for example, the original program that Siri was based off was bought. It was a private company, it was a startup that Apple bought the technology from, but the original funding and the original objective of that was military.
Yeah, and just before we head on to Sam Dimitri, a quick reminder that we have a question and answer box at the bottom, like all Zoom chats do. Please send in your questions to that, and we'll come to those in the Q&A just after I've spoken with Sam. I have seen the ones that are in the chat as well, and I've seen some of the ones that you sent in. Sam, you've just recently released a report on fixing copyright here in the UK, something that we can now do as part of having left the European Union. One of the sort of the benefits that you see. And I suppose it's really one of those cases. Yeah, you can have innovations coming out of your ears, but if you're not able to make use of them or monetize them, then what use are they to anybody? Do they actually get used? How do you go about fixing copyright, and how does that feed into technological progress?
Yeah, so I think copyright's an interesting issue. So in the past, there's been a lot of recognition from the government that the system doesn't work as well as it should, doesn't fulfill its fundamental aim of promoting creativity. There's been a few government reviews over the years. At the same time, what we've seen is technology kind of outpaces the law. So things like, technically, it's not legal to burn a CD or rip a DVD to your hard drive, but people obviously do it. A lot of platforms such as YouTube, there's inevitably going to be lots of infringement going along there, and also, so we've sort of created a new world of creativity in that sense that people that the law needs to adapt to. And at the moment, we've sort of done okay, partly because a lot of copyright infringement isn't enforced. So I'll give you an example of a case where it kind of highlights the issues with copyright law. So you might remember the song Blurred Lines by Robin Thicke and Pharrell Williams. So there's a Marvin Gaye song that sounds similar in some way. It definitely has a similar vibe or a similar feel. However, interestingly, it doesn't have the same rhythm, and it doesn't have the same melody, the same notes, or the same lyrics. So the question is, but a court in the US actually ruled that that song was, Blurred Lines was similar enough to that past song that it counted as a copyright infringement. So almost inspiration or creating the same feel as a song can technically lead to an infringement in some cases. Now, obviously that only really happens when a song is very, very successful and someone, because the costs of bringing a case are so high. But if you've ever, but the costs of enforcement are falling because of technological advancements. So things like AI can make it a lot easier to spot similarities in songs. So maybe in the future, you'll be a singer-songwriter, you'll write your own song, you'll upload it to YouTube, and you could receive a letter from EMI, who have used an automatic AI takedown service saying that your song is actually infringing upon their copyright. Maybe even Google will say, oh, we're a bit worried that this counts as a copyright and we have to comply with takedown notices. They might take down your song off YouTube, and then you might not have the opportunity to build up that fan base, or you might have to start from scratch and lose what you thought was a valuable piece of work. So I think that is quite an interesting case in terms of where the law needs to change, because we've basically currently got a law that's relatively well suited, or not perfectly, but is at least manageable in a case where we have mass infringement. But we're going to move to an era potentially of mass enforcement, and in that case we'll really need to rethink some of those rules so that they're not so overly onerous. There's always a trade-off. We want to encourage creativity, so we give artists a copyright so they can profit off their music or their books or their films or whatever. But we don't want to make that copyright too strong that it deprives the public domain. We don't want to say, if you make a space-based film because you were inspired by Star Wars, that you can't actually make that film. Because obviously every film and every idea borrows from other ideas. You know, Star Wars in itself borrows heavily from the works of Kurosawa, from samurai films. So they couldn't take some of those feels or some of those concepts or some of those broad plot outlines, then the ability of creating other great works would be limited. So you've got to strike a balance, and this is known in the IP world as the Tabarrock Curve. It's an idea suggested by Alex Tabarrock that you need IP, you can have under enforcement of IP, which reduces creativity and innovation, but you can also have over enforcement of IP, which also reduces creativity and innovation. So what the report does is it looks at some of the freedoms that the UK now has on copyright law. So a lot of copyright law is driven by the EU, but now we have the opportunity to diverge. And in fact, we've already diverged. So we haven't enforced the Copyright Directive of 2019. So you probably remember this. It led to the campaign, Don't Tread on Memes. Effectively, what it proposed was that there should be upload filters on use platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, Google, YouTube, whatever, should use upload filters so that when content is uploaded, infringing content is taken down before it even comes online. Problem is, a lot of infringing content or content that would at least be identified as infringing by upload filters is what we currently protected or exempt activity. So things like internet memes. So you're telling a joke, maybe you've got a screenshot from SpongeBob, and you said, you know, we did it, we saved the city. Maybe the algorithm says that SpongeBob meme is in fact infringing upon the copyright of Nickelodeon. And that gets taken down, and that would have a really chilling effect on online creativity and online communication. So that's one key issue. Another one that they put in the Copyright Directive recently was what's called a links tax. Effectively, what that means is that when Google posts a little snippet of an article so that you can decide whether or not to click, whether it's relevant, Google would have to compensate news firms. That's the EU's law policy, but it's also already been implemented in some countries. And what's happened in those countries is that services such as Google News have actually shut down. And Facebook said that if they were forced to pay publishers for every time they linked to them, they would just stop linking to publishers. And as a result, that's worse for the news industry, but it's also worse for the people who use the platforms. No one wins out. So that would be a real problem, I think. And so I'm glad that we've diverged on those fronts. But there's, I think, probably the most interesting area in terms of innovation of where we can diverge is in terms of AI. So one of the great things about machine learning is you can, just pile in data. Maybe you want to teach a new language learning tool. And one way you could do that is you could look at maybe look at the entire Netflix catalog, and they could watch all the films and then watch all the films again with Spanish subtitles or Spanish dubbing, and pick up little things, like just as we would learn as people. Now you can do that legally for non-profit uses under copyright law. So there is already an exemption for that. But if you want to make a profit-making product, maybe you want to make a new translation tool that uses Disney films in some of its machine learning process, you would have to ask for the individual permission of each of those, for each of the rights holders to all of those films you want to watch. And that, as a result, creates a little barrier in terms of what you can do. And potentially some of these new AI algorithms. So I don't know if you've seen DALL-E, which is the new, it's DALL-E like WALL-E rather than Salvador Dali, that is, but it's from OpenAI, the AI company originally founded by Elon Musk. And what it does is you can enter really, really specific terms. So you can say like a baby daikon radish holding a dog, cartoon style, and it will draw it for you. It will take on your concept and it will actually turn that into a real thing. So I think that is a really, really amazing use. But for all we know, some of the, sorry, my fan has just turned on, the wonders of the Internet of Things there. So one of the issues is that a lot of algorithms aren't transparent in what data sets they use. And one of the reasons for that may be because they don't want to incur any copyright cases. Now, it's not clear legally whether or not even that would count as a copyright infringement in the first place, but obviously companies don't want to face that legal uncertainty, and by eliminating that legal uncertainty, that means what we can have, we can provide startups and smaller companies who don't have access to the huge data sets that some of the larger AI companies, I'm thinking Facebook, I'm thinking Google, have access to, and it can help level the playing field and create more competition and more startups. So I think that's probably the most exciting area where we can reform copyright. But if you check out the report on our website, it's by Anton House, another ASI fellow who is head of innovation research at the Entrepreneurs Network. And what it does is it really looks at reforms that both make it easier for creators, but also don't harm existing rights holders. It very much removes transactions costs from the process. It removes unnecessary bureaucracy and makes it so that the public domain can be a lot larger and a lot better for creatives. So I really encourage people to check that out, and I'll post a link in the general chat if you want.
One of the sort of questions about evolution across the universe is a sort of theory of sort of great filters that happen as civilizations get more and more progressive. And I've sort of in my head, when you said these filters are coming in, automatic filters that basically get rid of new ideas, it sort of flashed into my head of how there's how one of the Chad Syverson, who was saying at the University of Chicago that it's actually harder and harder to find ideas. And how Adam Wozniak said the same thing. And it's sort of like, as you get into a more and more advanced society, where you then put up copyright, where you put up barriers to ideas being used in quite an egregious manner, you shove down the number of ideas that can be had, and therefore shove down the amount of growth that you can have. How much of a danger, how realistic a danger, especially if the internet is becoming sort of geographied. So US one looks different from the EU one, which looks different from the UK, which looks different from China's internet. Is the issue of copyright, is the issue of filters coming in to growth more potentially?
So I think that Siverson point's interesting because you can sort of think about knowledge in two ways, right? So there's the low-hanging fruit sort of option, saying maybe all the best songs have already been written. People have had all this time to write these really good songs, and the really good stuff in the past has been because we've picked all the low-hanging fruit. That's part of the subtitle to Tyler Cowen's book, How We Picked All the Low-Hanging Fruit and Got Sick. So that's one way of looking, but you could also look at it as the standing on the shoulders of giants model, that you know, each discovery makes it easier to make further discoveries. So, you know, think how quickly we were able to sequence the genome for COVID and then develop a vaccine. That was all building off past discoveries and made us much quicker at solving this particular problem. So there's sort of two ways of looking at it. I think in theory, intellectual property shouldn't create barriers, because ultimately it's about incentivizing people. So one of the main issues with innovation is actually the incentives to innovate are probably under rewarded by society. So even with patented innovations, a lot of people can maybe reverse engineer some aspect of your patent or come up with some other idea. So the spillover benefits from lots of innovation are really, really, really big. So William Nordhaus, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, he looked at it for a range of inventions, and he found that if you look at the general impact on productivity in society, inventors only capture about 2% of the rewards of their innovation. So on that sense, but I think what's the issue is that in an ideal world, we'd all contract with each other and we'd be able to license all of our intellectual property really, really easily and make up all these quick deals, and everyone, you know, would get to a win-win situation eventually. But the problem is that win-win situation is really hard to find because there's loads of transaction costs and bureaucracy in the way. And I think that's what we need to look at with copyright and patent law. How can we remove those barriers and make it a lot easier for people to make those deals? And some of the ideas in the report sort of touch on that.
There's that purist Randianism that I was expecting from you at some point, Sam. I'll bring Dan Kapura and Alex Stapp back in. In terms of, do you see anywhere in the world as being well placed to take advantage of both the innovations that are currently happening and the ones that you think are going to be the real game changers? Eamon Butler asks about who's my boss, and therefore gets first question, and the last question at the end is saying, you know, tech is much more important during the pandemic and also in the post-COVID world. The US has far more tech stocks, far more AI, biotech, IT, etc. Will it be able to recover quicker, faster, and more powerfully than countries like our own or other parts of the world? The EU not like having much fewer in terms of tech giants than the US, and China previously having them before they decided to disappear Jack Ma earlier this year.
Yeah, as the American, I'll go ahead and defend American exceptionalism and make the case that America is still well positioned. But I'll say is we can't be complacent, that's for sure. I'm most concerned about being overtaken by China than any other region in the world in terms of technological supremacy. That's mostly because the leadership in the country seems very focused and concerned about technological growth and investment. And so they've identified, I think, 6 or 7 areas of technology that they're targeting government resources in to the tunes of tens of billions of dollars a year. I believe it includes things like renewable energy, cryptocurrency, like blockchain technology, autonomous vehicles, et cetera. And so insofar as they've identified the right areas for future growth in the next few decades, they're definitely making the right investments right now. And they're really focused on creating a definite vision of the future that I think we should be worried about in the US, because we often underrate the importance of government investment in R&D. At least in the US over the last 50 years, used to have 2/3 of R&D spending in the United States used to come from the government, 1/3 came from the private sector. And that shifted over time. So now it's 2/3 private sector, 1/3 public sector. And the private sector is really good at commercialization and implementation of research once it's reached a relatively mature stage. But you really do need the government to come in, provide some kind of investment and subsidies at the basic research level, because private firms can't capture enough of the benefits to make the math work out, make the economics work. And so I think there's a huge role for the government to play. I think we've seen massive success in what purchase guarantees can do, and hopefully the experience of the crisis shows us that, okay, if you want to get a vaccine candidate out in record-breaking time, one way you can leverage both private sector prowess and government sector resources is you can, do purchase guarantees where the government says, we're going to purchase, 1 billion of these vaccines at X price, so long as they're safe and effective by the FDA. And you saw dozens of pharmaceutical companies go out and try that. We had 2 great successes early on in Moderna and Pfizer. Johnson & Johnson's on the way, AstraZeneca's on the way. And I think that really shows the complementarity there of, like, maybe the government, you shouldn't have government scientists actually doing the research, but you need those resources and you need that commitment of a future market to make that happen. And so I think the US, with our tech giants, with our history of technological leadership, we're well positioned to continue that in the future. But if we get complacent, if we don't invest public resources in these sectors, if we don't try to create a positive, definite vision for the future, we could definitely be overtaken by China and others.
And Dan, how do we inculcate a culture of both risk-taking, investment, and private sector entrepreneurialism that will provide that kind of same American exceptionalism here in the UK?
That's a difficult question. I mean, just to go back to what I was saying, or to answer Em's question, that R&D, particularly with the kind of general use, general purpose technologies that we're talking about that have these transformative effects, they don't stay within borders. Cheap electricity is solar power is the perfect example of this, right? Yes, it was a German subsidy, but ultimately, once the technology is out there, other countries are free to make it cheaper, more efficient, better, and that's a good thing. That's great. That's one of the benefits of globalization. And the country that makes the initial most difficult breakthrough isn't always the one that reaps the benefits. And the COVID vaccines again are another example of this, where the genome was sequenced unbelievably rapidly, but it was sequenced by Chinese scientists who then shared it internationally. It's not the case that it's not as simple as to say that the United States has great biotechnology or the UK has great biotechnology, and that's why we've got these vaccines. When you look at the number of vaccines around the world, it's in the dozens now. In terms of inculcating that kind of spirit of innovation in the UK, it's difficult. I mean, obviously, a huge basis of it is world-leading universities, which we have. We underfund them. The government tries to have its cake and eat it where it wants. And this is one of the sort of doubts I've always had about DARPA and this kind of thing, is whether politicians are willing to accept this kind of high risk, high failure rate type of research. And you see that with the way that investment works in the university sector. And actually, Cambridge and Oxford have done a very good job of themselves of figuring out how to spin companies out from their research labs. The work with Oxford and AstraZeneca is kind of a good example of this, of how to do good through their research, but also how to make sure that Oxford retained a slice of the proceeds, of the profits. Creating their own capitalist incentives, if you like. But the government can't. I don't think they can sort of pick and choose in the way they have done with the funding of universities. You either fund them generously or you don't. You can't say, well, we're going to very specifically fund these little labs, because that's not how research works. That's how you end up with a mess like graphene, where you try and pick this great technology that you think is going to revolutionize the world and doesn't. So yeah, I mean, that's one thing, is rather than necessarily trying to bring the expertise in-house, is to use the expertise that we've already got and fund it well. And then, the kind of the boring hard grind of public policy, of things like research grants. The government can set up excellence centers in the north if it wants. I don't know if they'll actually be able to draw the talent there. I mean, one of the biggest factors, which hopefully we will see and reap the benefits of, is immigration. That's been one of the United States' great successes, and one of their failures of recent years is that it was so easy and now it's so difficult to immigrate to the United States. We've ended free movement. The immigration system that we've set up is probably not generous enough in what it deems high skills. We should be making it far, far easier for international students to stay once they've come to this country to study. You can be selective if you want and say that only applies to STEM subjects, fine, but you need to do it, make it easier, make Britain an international hub for the people who have the drive to move halfway around the world and have the brains to come up with these ideas.
Sam, that's literally what your organisation does, so I'm going to let you do the advocate.
Yeah, a few thoughts based on what Daniel said. So, in terms of immigration, so we did a report that looked at the fast-growing companies in the UK. So we looked at the 100 fastest-growing companies in the UK, and we asked the founders whether or not they were born outside the UK or not. And we found 49 out of 99. We had to exclude one of the fast-growing companies because they went bust, which is kind of the nature with very, very fast-growing companies. But we found that 49 out of 99 of them had at least one immigrant founder. So, and when we talked to the founders, one of the recurring things was they came to the UK to study, and then they decided to stay in the UK afterwards. And one of the things that concerns me about the immigration system now that free movement has ended is how good the system is for certain things that some of the founders we spoke to did. So for instance, we spoke to an AI entrepreneur, and he started his company while completing his PhD. Would he be allowed to under current rules? I don't think so. I think if he was only allowed to do it because he was an EU citizen in the first place. So that kind of thing should be looked at, and making sure that it's as easy as possible for PhD students to then engage in entrepreneurship and bring those ideas. And that's actually one of the things I'm looking at the moment. So the report I'm currently working on is looking at how we can improve the process of commercializing ideas from university to market. It's quite an interesting area because basically most countries have decided that they'll copy the US. So the US has this thing called the Bayh-Dole Act, which basically says that the university, if they're government funded, they then own the IP for the idea. They can give as much as they want to the faculty. So each university has slightly different royalty schemes. But that system basically has each university with one tech transfer office, and the academic goes to that tech transfer office. And if they want to commercialize their ideas, and they're not willing to engage in the sort of grey market that definitely does go along, they have to work through that one office and one organisation. There's not really much competition. Now, some universities have really, really great records of tech transfer. So if you were to add up the value, add up the annual revenues of every startup founded by an MIT alumni, you would get the 10th largest economy in the world. So definitely Stanford, MIT, they do really great at it, but probably not every university does. And one of the issues is essentially you don't have competition between universities for commercialization. You essentially have and you don't really have competition on the sort of commercialization front at all, really, because if you're an academic, you probably don't know ahead of time if you want to commercialize your idea or not. That probably doesn't affect whether or not you choose to go to Stanford or you choose to go to Brown or wherever. So as a result, a lot of these institutions are insulated from competition. They're insulated from the sort of selection mechanism of the markets. So I think that is quite an interesting thing to look at, whether there's a better system. Some studies suggest what they have in Norway, in Italy. They used to have it in Cambridge. Cambridge, of course, has some really great spin-outs. ARM, at one point, had 60% of the world's smartphone market in terms of using its chips. And Cambridge, and I think some very, very old academics still have this system for them written into their very long contracts. But essentially, at Cambridge, the academic owned the idea entirely, and they were free to go to commercialize it however they wanted to. And that might be a better system of creating competition between universities. Maybe I'm at Manchester, but I think Imperial Innovations has a much better system of commercializing material sciences that aren't graphene. So I've decided that I'm going to want to do it with Imperial. You would open up all these sorts of freedoms, and that's what I'm looking at the moment, whether there's a way of moving towards a system like that.
Competitive marketplace. That seems like an interesting idea. Also, I was going to say, the less said about ARM, the better, especially around Westminster, because you start getting people marching to Beijing. In terms of, there's a question here by Malcolm Ward. I thought it was really interesting. He says COVID-19 is a global opportunity. It's the first time since the Second World War the global society has been focused on a single aim, to get out of the pandemic. In my head, what this has done actually is allow some of the moves on biotech to push ahead, so the mRNA, but also challenge testing, all this kind of stuff that didn't make it through the first round, the first wave, but now it's like people are seriously looking at the possibility for, and it's not really so much the product that's coming out, but maybe the process that's changing that's more interesting. And are you seeing that in other parts of tech as well?
Yeah, so I just want to comment briefly first on the biotech question. I think that is really crucial going forward. I've done a bit of research this last year on how the FDA has been handling the pandemic, and I think they really have dropped the ball early on and fixed things late. And so that it regards testing, regards vaccines, regards therapeutics, and kind of the main fix we could do in the future is that the FDA is not built for like wartime regulatory compliance. It's built for normal processes. It's often regarded as being too slow in general, but outside of an emergency, maybe you do want to hew towards safety and the safety and efficacy standard. But in an emergency with the pandemic, with a virus that's highly contagious, it's killing hundreds of thousands of people in the US, you probably want to hew more towards let's make sure it's effective and roll it out really quickly to get the virus under control and put less emphasis on safety. And so I think one fix we could do in the future is that when the Secretary of Health and Human Services declares a public health emergency, maybe we need to flip a lot of the default assumptions about what hospitals and private and public labs are able to do with testing, what they're able to do with certain therapeutics, to where maybe it could be like a move first, ask questions later approach, rather than the inverse of what we have currently, which might make more sense for normal times, but definitely does not during a public health emergency. And so I think that's an opportunity, and there's a lot of momentum right now. We'll see if it actually happens on a permanent basis, but a tweak to the rules like that, I think, could get a lot of room. And then on what COVID's done for the broader economy, I often think in terms of like, what can we do as people who care about public policy to like goose the private economy and help private companies grow faster? I think about often in terms of coordination problems. And so how can the government play a role there? And ironically, COVID has played a role in coordinating businesses to move and accelerate IT developments, right? So the barrier towards remote work and to moving more things to the cloud and adopting more SaaS enterprise technology is that, well, if other companies in your industry are doing it, it's much easier for you to do it. There's more skilled workers who are familiar with the technologies. And in terms of networking, like imagine like this event right now, we all have used Zoom dozens of times through the pandemic. We know how to use it. There's the norm of like, will we be meeting in person or doing it remote? It's what does your organization default to? And if you're having a video meeting, does everyone need to be on their own video screen? Or like, can you be some people be in a room together and then others are individually there? We're like rapidly working through a lot of these norms that I think got us out of this like maybe suboptimal point where there was no incentive for one firm or one individual to move, but now we've done it all collectively. I think there'll be quite a bit of staying power there. And that unlocks a lot of things. Like if now remote work is much more possible, then people can move to lower cost living areas. They can kind of technology can diffuse throughout the economy more. So there's a lot of like exciting possibilities there.
I think that's relatively true. I think one of the really interesting things for me is when there's a strike in London on the tube and people have to take a new route, or they take a new bus route, or they walk or whatever, about 10%, isn't it, Sandy, that like end up shifting forever their routes because they realize actually it was better, it was quicker. And you don't necessarily want to start the fire, but if the fire is already happening, you may as well make use of it, right? To change, to work out what's best. And I was wondering, sort of, the one for me that sort of always raises its head is, yes, you can have these innovations, you can have this thing, but the fear that comes out of people's people's sort of response to crises is always one of fear about whether their lives are going to change, whether their jobs are going to change, whether they're still going to have a job, whether they're still going to have income. And how do you ensure that there's the Pareto efficient outcome happens, right? That eventually not just society more generally, but also that people are well compensated for churn and change, especially this kind of large scale churn and change that we're seeing right now. And Sam, how do you do that first, and then how do you do it fairly? And then I'll come back to Dan on how he thinks politicians here in the UK will do it, which is a very different response.
Yeah, well, nice and easy question. I was just going to mention before I get to that on the inefficiency of the FDA. So an economist at Duke University actually saved probably millions of lives at this point by channeling FDA inefficiency to the greater good. So there's a thing called a priority review voucher. And so one way you can get fast-tracked approval for your drug, so not necessarily, it doesn't bias the process, but it just means they treat it like it's an emergency, kind of like they're doing now, where they're actually, getting decisions out very relatively quickly. One way you can actually get the priority review voucher to speed it up, and these review vouchers are worth, I don't know if they're worth billions, but they're in definitely there's hundreds of millions in terms of value. That's how inefficient the FDA is, and that kind of puts price on it. But essentially, the way drug companies can win those priority review vouchers is by developing drugs for the developing world. So developing things like low-cost pneumonial injections. So those sort of things that have been developed over the past 10 years, and some really amazing things, have been primarily driven by a need for companies to get around the inefficiency of the FDA. So that's one sort of Pareto optimal outcome, at least, sort of creating a system. But I think in terms of managing change, I think a few things need to be done. So first of all, we need to make it a lot easier for new business models in terms of retraining to work. So there's a cool startup in the US called the Lambda School. And essentially the way it works is if you want to learn how to code, you sign a contract. It's a bit like student loans in a way, I guess, but you sign a contract with this startup, and then if you get placed in a tech job and you earn something over like £40,000 a year, which is not that much money if you're a US tech worker in San Francisco, but is a lot of money, at least here, I think. If you earn that, then they take a portion of your income, kind of like the student loan model, but it typically doesn't last for the whole of your working lifetime. Like in the UK, it lasts more like 2 years or so, and they take that share, and that aligns the incentives. There's loads of merits to this model, and it seems to be having a real effect in terms of people going there, ending up getting placed at Google or Facebook and all these big companies. But in the UK, for instance, such a model is regulated by the Consumer Credit Act. Now, you could think of a student loan as a credit card agreement, but if you advertise the sticker price for a student loan as if it were a credit card agreement, it wouldn't seem very favourable. There'd be loads and loads of problems with it, essentially. But at the moment, the way we regulate these new products is as if they were consumer credit products. So what you need is regulators who can say, actually, this isn't like a credit product, a consumer credit product. This isn't a credit card. This is a new model of student loans. So maybe we should regulate it completely differently. Maybe we need to provide enough regulations that people feel confident that they're not going to get absolutely ripped off or scammed by anyone. But we don't want to regulate it as if it was a high interest loan. So I think at the moment you have to advertise such a loan as if it was a 50% annual loan or something really crazy, which potentially is not going to get many people to sign up to these schemes. Makes it much harder to advertise them. So that's one issue. And also I think you have to give people the right to buy it out. And that creates its own problem. So that's one issue that you could perhaps resolve. So make these new business models, change the regulations so they can get off the ground. But I think you also have to look at the welfare system and look at how it works. I'm pretty favourable to sort of a flex security model. So something where I think the welfare system should probably be a lot more generous than it is if you've recently lost your job. But then perhaps that generosity should be time limited. We published a paper way back before I was at the ASI even, on time limiting welfare, and I think that's potentially one model. So perhaps you can make up quite a lot of your loss of income, and you're much more willing to then tolerate a year, a little while out of work while you're transitioning from career to career, but at the same time it doesn't create that incentive for long-term unemployment, those sort of poverty traps that we are so aware of. So that's one way of, I think, doing it. That would be quite a dramatic shift from the way we do welfare at the moment, but I think that would potentially work. Another way is looking at how you can access government support in terms of training. Maybe instead of having having that student loan that you can access, maybe that money should be converted into a lifetime loan, and that you can access that for whatever training you want, whether it's a university or whether it's a private vocational provider. Maybe people should have that kind of support more generally. So I think there are things we can do, definitely.
I think I heard transitioning from career to career is the countries, and I thought that had a very different impact on property rights. In terms of Dan, how does the politics in the UK really respond to churn and change, and especially this particular churn and change in this pandemic?
It's interesting, right? So I think there's a couple of things to come out of this. To look at this government claims to believe in sort of creative destruction and all this kind of stuff, but I think you saw what it really thinks in the summer, July and August, when Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak tried to push people back into offices when it was clearly a terrible idea, on the basis they wanted to save the commuter economy, to save Pret, to save these businesses that serve offices. Now, in terms of if they'd carried on with the furlough scheme and forced those businesses to close, then that's fine, because maybe this time next year everyone will be back in their offices as much as before and going to Pret as much as before. But if they really believed in creative disruption, they would be giving grants to people who want to set up coffee shops in commuter belt towns, helping people set up new businesses and transition. So I think we saw their reaction to change there. But in terms of what I think we can see, sort of positive change and good things that come out of this, is two things really. Well, one thing, but applying to two different things, which is one is this thing of high risk, low probability events. So the pandemic is not a black swan event, really, as people call it, because we've been warned about it a bunch of times and there've been loads of pandemics, but it was high risk, low probability, and the government prided itself supposedly on having the greatest plan in the world, but it was for a flu pandemic, not for a coronavirus pandemic. But one of the most fascinating things about the mRNA technology we've been talking about is that the Moderna vaccine, I think it was actually ready on January the 6th. It was done. They'd created it. Now, obviously, that's not to say that the next sort of 6 months of trials and tests and everything else shouldn't have gone ahead, but it is to say that what that means for the future. The really great thing about this technology is because it's kind of modular and you can change it to suit different viruses, different diseases, is that we could, by spending a relatively small amount of money, in the low billions, have pre-approved vaccines for hundreds of viruses, hundreds of diseases, some of which don't exist yet. We're predicting the mutations, predicting these viruses that might emerge, and they would be already been through phase 2 trials, maybe even phase 3 trials, ready to go within 3 months instead of 9 months. But the government, to have that, will have to spend a few billion pounds on something that they may never ever need, and it's convincing the politicians to do that. And I'd like to think that this will have created a cultural change. The second scenario that applies to is a high risk, very high probability, a certain event, which is climate change, right? And I think that initially there were fears that this would be somewhat like 2008, where everyone started to worry about the economy, worry about themselves, and worry less about the environment. I hope that the actual impact of this is the opposite. One, because it's created a change in attitudes. It's kind of reinforced the idea that we need to act and act fast. And two, because it has created this opportunity, the kind of the NAF slogan, build back better. A lot of that is being channeled into efforts to fight climate change. And that's one of the kind of the underappreciated or undermeasured elements of productivity. It's not really measured, but it's mitigating externalities, right? Because if we all die in a pandemic, that's terrible for productivity. So you know, avoiding damage is as important as creating growth. And then obviously, in theory, the results of this kind of fight against climate change, for example, you know, very, very cheap electricity to the point where perhaps it's not even metered. You know, it's more like a subscription service, at least for the consumer. The benefits of that are the kind of general use technologies that can spark further, you know, rapid productivity growth.
Grand. And then I'll hand my final words, and then I will wrap up to Alec. You've got a new guy in the White House tomorrow, supposedly, hoping all goes well. How does that change the political scene? How does that change the technological scene in the USA?
Yeah, well, fortunately, they have tens of thousands of military troops in DC to ensure that there's a peaceful transition of power. So we're all expecting it to go smoothly.
Nothing says
tomorrow.
Peaceful like tens of thousands of troops.
Exactly. There won't be a shot fired. Yeah, so we're optimistic. I think in the US, the huge thing was actually winning the special election runoff in Georgia, where we had 48 Democratic seats in the Senate, 50 Republicans, and the Democrats winning both those elections a few weeks ago meant that we have 50-50 control of the Senate, plus the vice president as a tiebreaker vote. So now Democrats have a trifecta in the US government with the House, the Senate, and the White House. And so we actually get big things done. And so the Biden administration is pushing a $1.9 trillion relief package on top of the trillions we've already spent. The immediate question there is like, oh no, hyperinflation, or is this too much? But long-term interest rates are still negative. The market is predicting inflation will not hit its 2% target the Federal Reserve is targeting. So if anything, we need even more stimulus in this. We're not going to get it if Republicans continue to control the Senate. And this has implications for technology, for growth, the entire economy. And so fortunately, we have unified government at least for the next 2 years, which will allow Washington to get more things done, like parliamentary systems can sometimes do.
2 years, that is an optimistic take. That's not how quickly those seats change. Well, definitely. But thank you so much, Sam, Alec, and Dan, for joining us. And thank you all for joining us as well. We're back next week on Tuesday when Morgan Schondelmeyer, our resident American in-house and head of external affairs, will be looking at Biden's first 100 days and the special relationship. She's going to be joined by Freddie Gray of Spectator USA, the editor there, and Joseph Sternberg of the Wall Street Journal. I hope you can join us then, 6 p.m. UK time next week. Thanks, guys.